How long have you been in orcharding?
I grew up on the orchard, um, but I went away to college. Couldn't wait to leave town, and by the time I graduated from college, couldn't wait to come back. And I worked for the state of Washington for a year, and then ended up coming back to the family farm. And so I've been on the family farm since 1980.
Okay. Can you please explain to us your current method of operating your orchard?
Um, I have a number of leases and plus orchards that I own, and I have a foreman that has worked for me. He's actually been working in our orchard longer than I have. He came while I was uh, away to college, and he and his wife and little daughter started then, and they've stayed with our family ever since. And so what I do is I defer most of the labor part of the operation to him. Uh, I don't micromanage him. He knows expectations that we've decided on together, and then he hires the people that he thinks can help accomplish that, and then does it. And you know, uh, if he has an idea of how to do something uh, that's different than mine, we'll talk about it a little bit. But if I can't think of any reason why mine is better than his, we go with his way. Figuring that gives a feeling of ownership and a feeling of responsibility. And so I pretty much take care of the financial end of things and the management end of things. Uh, but I let him take care of the labor part, which is the vast majority of farming right
Okay. Which fertilizer do you use and why do you prefer that one?
now. We use mostly calcium nitrate. It's got a good balance for the soils here. But an example like this year, we always take soil tests, and after the samples come back, then we decide where we need to fertilize and where we don't. And we fertilized probably a third of our total acreage this year. Um, some of the places showed that the levels of calcium and the nitrogen of the soil were adequate, so there wasn't any reason to add to it. And uh, some years we've used ammonium nitrate, but that changes the pH. And so calcium nitrate's typically what we use.
Mm.
Um, has your current method of fertilizer changed since once you started the orchard business?
How we apply it or
No,
the type?
just the type of fertilizer. Have you basically just stick to the same one for most of the years, just for preference?
Typically with our soils and that calcium nitrate is what is the most common. There have been years when we've used ammonium nitrate, partly because it's cheaper, but you get the same results. But like I said before, it can change the pH of the soil, which affects the growth of the trees and the color of the apples and all that. And so what we find is if we use ammonium nitrate, then we have to go through and use lime later to readjust the pH. And so it's best if we, right now there hasn't been anything better than the calcium nitrate that we put on the ground. But we also do fertilize the leaves and the blossoms with sprays. We'll use urea, we'll use different things, but they're much smaller amounts, and it's more just for the apple itself and the leaves themselves.
How do you disperse your fertilizer?
We used to do it by hand, um, but now we do it with a machine that we can calibrate, and put on the exact amount that we want. And it goes on the back of a tractor, and then you just drive up and down the rows, and it spreads it, sending it to the root zones.
Does certain fertilizer make your crops grow better than others, or do you have a favorite fertilizer?
Yes, there's some that make things grow better, but with fertilizers, you still have to be careful, because what happens is sometimes you'll put on a fertilizer that will make the trees grow, and the limbs will grow really fast and everything else. But what it tends to do is it tends to not color the apples, and the end desire is to get the apple exactly the way you want it, not grow a big tree or anything else. You need a tree to fill its space, so you fertilize according to that. But you don't want to have, you don't put on fertilizer just to make trees grow. You try to put it on just the right amount so that the trees don't get too much nitrogen, but you don't want to starve them either, or else the trees will stop growing completely and shut down. And no, that's, go ahead.
What types of law or regulations have changed the types of fertilizer that you've used, if any?
With the fertilizers that we use, it hasn't changed a lot, other than now you have to be a lot more careful how you store it. You have to be a lot more careful about what you put on, but we've always been concerned about runoff and about different things like that, because for us, it doesn't make any sense to put on too much fertilizer, because that's just spending money you don't need to spend. And farming is a business, and so you have to take care of your expenses. You have to be smart about what you're doing. Just because anything that leaves the farm in runoff, or in whether it just saturates through the soil, or runs off in big rains, or when the snow melts or anything else like that, is just a waste of money. Even if you don't care about anything else, it's a waste of money. But there are fertilizers that are harder to come by, because they've been used in bombs before, and but those aren't the ones that we use.
Do you have more business a few years ago than you do now?
In what way?
Like more jobs to offer, more employment?
Okay. We do, mostly because we have more acres than we used to have. We can hire the same people for more full-time than we could when we were a smaller business. But with ours, we aren't trying to pick mechanically, or trying to do things that way that are reduce a lot of jobs. Labor is still 80% of our cost, but we do try to do things to reduce the amount of labor, like thinning sprays and things like that. But as far as overall labor, we pretty much use the same number of people per acre that we used to use.
How has fertilizer changed over the past years?
Fertilizer itself, the product, I don't know, has changed as much as the methods of applying it, or the methods of determining the testing for where you need it and where you don't. An example is if you have a lot of Golden Delicious. What you find is if you keep fertilizing those, the apples stay green, and at harvest time you're waiting for a color break, and when those apples stay green, you have to wait and wait and wait, and then it runs into another variety that you need to get to pick. And so what you find is if you reduce the amount of fertilizer that you put on your Golden Delicious, the trees still grow well. They they produce well, and then the apples don't stay green so long, so you can pick them earlier, or when you want to, basically. And so the testing and the science around how much fertilizer to apply, and some trees like Golden Delicious, you may not apply to those once they have fill their space in the row. You might not apply fertilizer to Goldens again. Whereas a tree like Granny Smith, you want those apples to stay really green, and those you tend to not thin as much, and so you're trying to push those with fertilizer, and so those you'll apply more fertilizer to. So those are things. The way we use fertilizer has changed more than the product itself.
Okay.
Is that what you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
How has the weather altered the amount of crops you yield a year?
That's one of the most frustrating things about farming. Probably second only to government is the weather. You have absolutely no control over. The government, you can at least write a letter to and complain, right?
Yeah.
But with the weather, you can't do anything. This time of the year, this temperature doesn't hurt anything because the trees are dormant. If we had these temperatures in fall, which we have had before, it'll freeze the apples right on the tree. You can get away with that in some varieties once or twice if they don't freeze solid and stay frozen for a number of days. But if they freeze too long, then you can't pick them, and so that reduces your harvest. If it's cold in the spring, and you can't control it with frost protection, then it can kill the buds, can kill the flowers before they even form apples, or it'll deform the apples. It'll kill seeds, some of the seeds, and not all of them, so you get a lopsided apple, which ruins the apple. And so the weather there, the cold has a big effect in the fall and then in the spring. And then you have times when you go from, like this last spring was a warm spring, and it never really got cold, and so the apples continued to grow from the time they flowered all the way through harvest. So the apples generally were pretty big, bigger than normal for us. Where typically it gets warm, you have your blossom time, and then it cools off a little bit, and that slows down the growth. And then it picks back up as things warm up. So that makes a lot of difference. The weather does that way. Then comes the heat. If you have enough heat, it'll sunburn the apples. It'll actually burn the skin or discolor the skin, or cause the apples to basically bake if it gets too hot for too long. And then the apples, even though they may look good, will rot internally. And so you may go through all the expense of picking and everything else and getting them ready to pack, and then you can't pack stuff because the pressure's gone, the things happen because of the heat. And so there are things that we do, whether it's cooling with water or putting on sprays to a wax that kind of deflects the sun and the heat. But they're all things you have to combat all the way through. There are windstorms that'll knock off crops. And so the weather has a huge effect